Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer J.J. Bonella, here with Drew Conry Murray, and we have a action-packed news roundup for you this week. Drew, tell them what they've won.
We're going to be talking about thousands of devices that have been pwned, various manufacturers. We're going to be talking about why Microsoft's RDP allows you to use revoked credentials to log in. We're going to be talking about ConnectWise Screen Connect, suspicious activity and implications of that. There's also a whodunit. A 19-year-old has pled guilty to a massive PowerSchool breach. JJ, what else are we talking about?
Well, it wasn't Signal. We're going to talk about why the government was using TeleMessage and how that was hacked in 20 minutes. There's also a critical OneDrive permission flaw that we think everybody should probably know about. And then a new thing happening. We see attackers pivoting through Microsoft Mailbox and folder delegated access. So we want to hit on that a little bit too. So, Drew, you have been just mysteriously gone for a past week or week and a half or so, and you were at the conference AutoCon. Tell us a little bit about AutoCon and then what you saw there that might be interesting.
Yeah, hopefully you didn't notice my absence because we preloaded some shows to cover us while we were gone. But yeah, I was away at AutoCon. This is a conference put on by the Network Automation Forum. The goal is essentially to bring together learners and practitioners to advance the state of the art of network automation. It's a twice yearly conference, one in the US, one in Europe. I was at the Europe one. If you're interested, you want to go check out networkautomation.forum. And as you might guess, it's about network automation, so there wasn't a whole lot of security-related material there. There was one talk that was security-focused about using an automation platform called Glueware to help automate switch and router OS upgrades when security patches are released. And I wrote up a quick blog about it that I've included in the show notes if you want to go read it. But again, all about network automation. And frankly, I would, myself personally, and probably others there, would be interested in seeing more security-focused talks. So if you're into network automation, you have a security use case, they're always looking for speakers. So go check out networkautomation.forum because AutoCon 4 is coming up in the US in November. So yeah, it's a great show. It's like small, tightly focused, really good content. They do workshops ahead of time so you can learn all kinds of stuff. Yeah, it's a great show.
Nice. And I saw your LinkedIn posts where you wrote that up. You did that for a lot of the talk. So if you're interested in what was covered there, I would encourage you guys to go check out Drew's feed in LinkedIn. And I imagine probably there will be some articles floating around Packet Pushers somewhere following this as well.
Yeah, so Ethan Banks, who founded Packet Pushers and co-hosts the Heavy Networking Podcast and others, he and I both essentially live blogged every session over 3 days. So they're on our LinkedIn feeds, and we also link to them in our Human Infrastructure newsletter. If you're a newsletter subscriber, you could get that issue. We're going to try to find another way to also probably get them on our website and stuff. And all the talks were recorded, and they will be up on the Network Automation Forum's YouTube channel probably over the next couple of weeks. So you can see everything that we saw. And a lot of the talks are really great, especially if you're into network automation.
Yeah, nice. Well, we have a big lineup today of news. We're not going to make it through all of the news, but we're going to see how far we get today.
Yeah, before we get exhausted. Okay, so kicking off, you've probably heard about this, but since March, thousands of ASIS routers have been backdoored, creating a collection of compromised devices that could be used as a botnet. Researchers from Grey Noise published an advisory describing the campaign. ASIS is a Taiwanese company. It makes a variety of products, including routers aimed at the gaming community. There's a Security Week article about it. Notes that the core exploit targeted a command injection vulnerability, which was published as a CVE back in September 2023. I think the big issue here, JJ, is that this backdoor is persistent. So, if you want to reboot or do a firmware upgrade, the backdoor will persist. So you actually have to do a factory reset and then install a patch if you want to get rid of this.
Yeah, that was what was kind of alarming to me, that the way they injected this, and I'm not a coder in any way, shape, or form, including on networking equipment. So I followed along with a lot of it, but it's kind of living off the land because they're using actual configuration settings. They can do things to make it survive firmware updates. So just kind of like if you as a normal person administering or managing that device were setting certain things, they are just doing that in combinations that give them persistence. So it does, it survives firmware upgrades, factory reboots. And it did say also most anti-malware scans. I don't know which scanning tools. I know we have some things that do some Linuxy stuff with networking equipment. I'm not sure specifically which malware scan products they're saying this bypasses, but we are talking about thousands of devices. And it looked like in that Security Week, and actually it was Ryan Narain that wrote this up. I love Ryan. I've known him for a long time. He did a great job. So check that out. But they used a mix of brute force logins, 2 older authentication bypass flaws, and then that 2020 command injection bug. And then they did the stuff, to living off the land, made configuration changes and got persistence there. And then linked in there too, what we saw was that separately, so different situation, but related and similar time frame, a French research company posted a blog about a new threat actor that's compromised. They estimate, with a couple of partners and Intel coming into that, they're estimating like 5,500 edge networking devices and have turned them into honeypots for discovery. And the article said, including 50 different brands of, SSL, VPN, DVRs, et cetera. So I went down a little rabbit hole there and clicked into their original write-up. And I was kind of surprised because I expect to see the consumer products there. But, I'm going to read off a few names here. D-Link was no surprise. Some Cisco products, including Cisco Catalyst SD-WAN. That was a little bit of a surprise. TP-Link, TrendNet, Linksys, Zyxel, Aris, Asus. So you got a mix of consumer and enterprise. And then you get into things like the DVR and security cameras and infections of Honeywell, AVTech, Axis, Panasonic, Samsung, D-Link again. And then, of course, Avanti, Fortinet, Cisco, Citrix, Checkpoint. And then there were some other weird wireless things and printers. So Ruckus, Ubiquiti, Cambium, and Canon printers, and then several NAS products. So I guess my point in this is when I see a headline like this, the first thing I think is, oh yeah, your crappy consumer stuff just got owned by whoever's going to run a botnet. But there might be some of this in your enterprise space as well.
So you said this was being used as a honeypot. I'm familiar with honeypots being used by quote unquote good guys as a way to see if there's malicious activity happening. How do threat actors use honeypots?
Okay, I'm going to make some assumptions here because I skimmed through that article. I did not, and I think it was, I don't know how they pronounce it. It's a French company, SEKOIA.io. So Sequoia, maybe, .io.
Sounds right, yeah.
We got a link in the show notes. I probably got this wrong. You can slap me on the hand and feedback comments later. But I'm guessing, I would think if I were a threat actor to know who is scanning what, looking for what, so that I could avoid those things if I were maybe going to deploy a malware botnet somewhere.
So a honeypot to see if anybody else is going to try to take over my botnet.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would think. However, I'm a defensive architect and not an offensive person, so my brain is geared a little bit differently for that. So there's probably other reasons that somebody offensively would be doing that.
Okay. I think the big picture here, though, is that edge devices, always a prime target. ASUS, I think, primarily is like home user or maybe Soho. So that's also a great target because some of these are pretty high-powered, high-capability routers, lots of throughput. Great target if you're going after consumers who may or may not be security aware and may or may not know how to do a factory reset even to get rid of this persistent attack.
Yeah. Now, here's my magic fortune telling ball. I'm a little bit curious if some of these are on the enterprise space. I'm kind of not probably this year or next year, but future, maybe 5+ years out. I do wonder if we're going to get to a place where a victim might have an individual victim or a class action lawsuit from multiple victims may come after enterprises that didn't address this type of vulnerability. And those devices within the enterprise were used to launch attacks against other targets. Do you know what I mean?
No, I don't know what you mean. Who's the victim here?
Okay. So let's say I'm a large company. In fact, I'm just going to pick company names. And obviously I'm just picking things that are familiar to people. Let's say I'm Walmart and I have a big footprint and I don't address vulnerabilities in devices that I have deployed at all of my stores. Some malicious actor takes over those devices, turns that into a malware botnet, and then uses that to attack victims. Either to distribute malware or to, if it's, let's say it's China and they're attacking US critical infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. I just wonder if there's going to be a future where an enterprise like that at scale might be held liable for not being a good citizen and updating their stuff.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. I'm not saying that's a thing right now. I'm just wondering. I'm just forecasting.
Okay, so 2 things you can follow up with us on. One is the threat actor honeypots, and 2 is if you're a lawyer. Is there a case here? Is there a potential class action case?
Obviously, hashtag not a lawyer. But again, I don't think that would happen in the next year or 2, but I just wonder if the climate and the expectations over time will change as we have more information.
Yeah, could be. It's definitely fertile ground for the legal profession.
Yeah.
Okay, links in the show notes. We'll move on. Oh, and by the way, if you want to reach out, packetpushers.net/FU or packetpushers.net/follow-up, depending on your appetite for humor.
If you're listening to this podcast, you better have a pretty dang good appetite for humor.
So a security researcher informed Microsoft that he was still able to log into Windows desktops via RDP using revoked passwords. According to a story in Ars Technica, Microsoft's response was, yep. So apparently it's a security risk Microsoft is willing to take to ensure that at least one user account can log in. In other words, this is a conscious design decision by Microsoft.
Yeah, I first heard about this actually on the Risky Business podcast, where they dug into this pretty deeply. And then, of course, the regular weekly articles came through from various places. First of all, it's not new. It was reported a couple years ago, and it's just bizarre to me. So, the TLDR is, I think we all expect if you have RDP enabled and we think something has happened, an account has been compromised, credentials were scraped, whatever, the first thing that we do is we either disable that account or we change the password, right? That's what you do. And then obviously, hopefully enable two-factor for appropriate use cases there. Well, the problem that's been found here by Daniel and others is that Microsoft decided they don't want people to ever be stupid enough to lock themselves out of a system in an RDP session. So instead of honoring credential changes and revocations of passwords, what they've done is gone in and said, oh, well, you poor little thing, we don't want you locked out. So we have this cached area of stored credentials on the system, and we're going to look to that first. So that means that it sounds like multiple prior passwords will all work.
Yes.
Sometimes even when the new one won't. And it depends on how the device is syncing, whether it's offline or not. But yeah, the Microsoft statement is it's a design decision to ensure that at least one user account always has the ability to log in no matter how long a system has been offline. I think most of us in the security space thinks that's horrible and it's a complete rubbish way to go about it. And there's also no indicators that that's happening. So monitoring doesn't trigger. There's no alarms anywhere on system, in the infrastructure, or in, Defender, Entra ID, Azure, et cetera.
Yeah. It's surprising to me, given, Microsoft's reputation around security, that they would allow this, because they have taken steps to try to become a more secure provider of technology. I guess from a user support issue, they're like, we need to let them be able to get in. But yeah, it seems like a huge risk.
Yeah. And in his report, he made a statement that I entirely agree with, was that basically this feature or bug creates a silent remote backdoor into any system that the password has ever been cached. I totally agree with that. And if you don't have any indicator, at least something triggering into a log or an alert saying an expired password was used or a revoked or an inactive account was used for something.
Right.
I still don't like it. I still think it's dumb, but just give us some way to know that that happened.
Right. Yeah, crazy. But again, links in the show notes if you want to go look it up. Moving on, Reuters is reporting that, quote, unexplained communication equipment, end quote, was found inside a small number of Chinese-made power inverters. Power inverters are used to connect solar panels and wind turbines to electricity grids. They typically have remote access capabilities for things like updates and maintenance, but Reuters spoke to two unnamed sources who said that experts have taken apart power inverters in the US and found communications components that weren't listed in product documents. So the fear here is that China could use undocumented communication systems to bypass security controls and disrupt electric grids for whatever electric company or other utility is using these power inverters.
Yeah. Now, you said, and they quoted, unexplained communication equipment. I have a few ideas explaining that. Yeah, so these power inverters are what we use to convert AC to DC power or DC to AC power. It's not just used in those cases. It's used all over the place, including, car charging systems and anytime we need to make that conversion.
Yep.
So we've seen this movie before and we've heard this song before. We had similar unexplained communication equipment, including cellular equipment that were found in those Chinese manufactured cranes that run all of the ports across the US.
Right. Cranes used to get containers off of cargo ships had cellular radios in there that shouldn't have been or weren't expected to be there. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, sometimes you might listen to these stories and go, okay, big deal. But when you start to think about, back several years ago when Maersk, the major shipping company, had a cyber incident, that and one other company that was impacted brought more than a fifth of the world economic trade to a halt.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we start talking about, these are massive cranes that are moving all of this stuff, when we get anything overseas, right, it comes by sea. So the cranes at the ports are a huge thing. Now we're talking about power inverters that are, directly connected to the grid and the systems that are running on and off of the grid, sometimes taking from the grid, putting back onto the grid. So, there's lots of opportunity for disruption in the power system, not even getting down to the more consumer level if, let's say, EVs are impacted. Now, I don't think anybody yet knows, or if they do know, they're not sharing whether this is actually nefarious or this just was an oopsie on their part.
Mm-hmm.
But there have been a lot of very suspicious oopsies. And one thing that was kind of buried in the article that I thought was alarming is it said in November of last year that there were some solar power inverters in the US and elsewhere that were disabled from China. And that was in a Reuters article. They said they were not able to determine how many or the extent of the disruption, and the Department of Energy here would not comment on that issue. So this is not just this could happen. Apparently this has already happened.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just been kept quiet, best I can tell.
Neither Reuters nor their sources said how many devices they found, whether they were actually connected to US infrastructure, just that they had examined these power inverters. So we don't know sort of the scope of this potential problem. And yeah, we also don't know whether this is an oversight, whether it's actual nefarious activity. But it does, I think, point to a larger picture of like, I feel like we're kind of in a technological Cold War with China, essentially. Like, we're not shooting, but there are issues that we are.
We're shooting packets.
Right. Or getting ready to shoot packets. Like, the systems are ready and waiting.
Yeah.
But I also feel like in some ways it's a trap of our own making, because American consumers, American corporations, they want to pay the lowest cost possible for stuff, which, for the past 30 years has meant China. At the same time, we want robust manufacturing and good paying jobs, and these things are hard to square. So we are where we are.
Yeah. And I know I say this often, or I don't know if I do here or not. This all runs together in my head sometimes. But, one of the concerns we have that's been proven through, multiple investigations across many years is that, China has purposefully created and sold things under their cost of production. And I think we had this conversation a few weeks ago when we talked about the possible TP-Link ban and some other, things like that. Now that's a US-based company, but, they're watching that the Chinese company, especially in consumer and SOHO markets, are drastically increasing adoption and market share in a short period of time. Like, it's a logarithmic spike upward and taking, 60 and 80% of market share in the past, 3 years or so. And the technology products are not the only thing that China is doing with this with. They've done it with things like internet and connectivity and cables and lines in other countries that they lay down when the other country doesn't have the resources to do that, and then have some ownership into that. So long story short, there is a history of, China as a government making some decisions to do things below cost to get themselves, just like certain manufacturers in the US might, steeply discount, if Cisco and HP are going against each other, they're each, sometimes they'll do crazy stuff, but it's consistent from China.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we do it too, or American corporations do it too. But yeah, it's a well-known practice. My takeaway, I think, is that obviously if we can identify these potential risks and eliminate them, that's great. If we can rely on more homegrown or products grown in more democratic countries, that's great. But I'll also note that China and other nation-state actors have demonstrated ample capability at taking out U.S. infrastructure and U.S. systems without having to resort to rogue hardware, like just the bad software quality and the difficulty of securing these systems. They don't need like sneaky hardware in systems to get us. So
yeah, not yet anyway. But I think it's hard because, if we're talking about any type of wireless communication, whether it's satellite, cellular, Wi-Fi, but there's all these other things that are low power, long range. Like LoRaWAN type stuff that we're seeing now. I mean, some of these things are tiny. They're half the size of your thumb.
Sure. And the other thing is, like, our supply chains are so intermixed that maybe on the box it says it came from, I don't know, Singapore or whatever, but who knows what's in there?
Goodness. I mean, having worked with the federal reseller for a long time, it's TAA compliant devices, but it's like pieces of stuff come from random countries, but the final assembly is in wherever, Taiwan or
Right.
Mexico or something. And I mean, tracking that is, it's crazy. So it's not an easy problem to solve.
Definitely not. And is it the problem we need to be most worried about? I don't think so, but obviously someone's looking at it.
Yeah. I mean, most worried about, maybe not. However, I don't think we should ignore it because, like any attacker, I feel like they kind of layer themselves. And so it's like, well, we're going to go for the low hanging fruit. But once that gets discovered and cut off, we need whatever that next layer is going to be. And I think they have been embedding themselves in for well over a decade at this point.
You're right. Yeah, good point. All right, moving on, ConnectWise, which makes remote access and remote management software for IT service providers, have released a security advisory warning of suspicious activity targeting customers of its Screen Connect remote support and remote access software. The company is attributing this suspicious behavior to a nation-state actor. The company didn't elaborate on what the suspicious activity was and says it has contacted all affected customers and hired Mandiant to investigate. But this activity does seem related to a patch the company issued in April.
I have nothing against ConnectWise. I am curious about attributing it to a nation state actor when they won't share any other details. Although, it is possible that there's an ongoing investigation. But I feel like we've heard, oh, it's nation state. Oh, it's a sophisticated attack. Oh, it's, this, when it's like, oh, we didn't have multi-factor turned on for three of our main accounts,
Right. There are ways to write the alert to make it sound like you were the target of a concerted effort by evil Chinese villains when...
And maybe they were.
And maybe they were, but...
Working with a lot of organizations, especially in public sector and in critical infrastructure, one of the very common platforms that they would use would be ConnectWise for remote access. So it could be that they are being targeted because of the customers that use them, and they are often just spun up by whoever needed to provide that access and therefore not centrally managed. So, lots of lack of visibility there. But I guess the moral of the story is like, we have no clue what's going on here, and
Yeah.
it doesn't matter. I think the moral of the story is really that anytime you may have remote access into your environment, whatever that is, IPsec tunnels, SSL VPN, remote desktop, these type of things, we need to make sure that they're inventoried and we're monitoring all of that. And we do that at endpoints. If we have, on-prem network infrastructure, there's opportunity to do that, within the infrastructure, at the firewalls, whatever. Do it as many places as you possibly can and, see what of these tools are running various places. And I do think it's probably important to have visibility on the endpoints if those endpoints are ever outside of the building that you're monitoring. So yeah, get a handle on how people are getting in and out.
Yeah, for sure. All right, links in the show notes. We'll move on. I think in a previous news roundup, we talked about the PowerSchool breach. PowerSchool is a ed tech company. They essentially help teachers and students track assignments and grades and so on. They got hacked. More than 60 million records on students were stolen. More than 10 million teachers were stolen. Now they've actually caught the person who did it. It's a college student. This college student has agreed to plead guilty to breaking into PowerSchool. He's also charged with stealing confidential information from a service provider. He demanded a ransom from PowerSchool and also demanded a ransom from the service provider. He is now facing federal charges. I will note that the U.S. Attorney's Office that is charging this person didn't officially specify PowerSchool as the name of the victim, but the facts of the story line up with previous reporting on the PowerSchool breach. And NBC News report quotes, "A person familiar with the matter told NBC News that it is PowerSchool." So I'm confident in saying, yes, this PowerSchool was the victim here.
Yeah, I was really interested to see how this was going to shake out because PowerSchool is used by a lot of schools.
Yeah, my kids' schools used it. So
yeah, throughout US and Canada. I mean, I don't even have kids in school and I got a notice about it. So but they're kind of like, I don't want to call it the whole school management platform, but depending on I guess the modules that they have enabled, they have a lot of data because the school still tracks students by social security numbers. They're probably going to have parents' information, home addresses, etc. But if they have, counselor's office, any medical info related to medications that they're on and they need to be monitored for, or allergies or anything like that. Most schools also have counselors, so there could be mental health data that's tracked in this app, along with your normal, homework and assignments and junk like that. So to me, if you're talking about, 60 million students, that's a large body of data that is potentially harmful.
Yeah, particularly when you can tie name, address, social security number together, that's ripe for identity theft.
Oh, yeah. What sounded a little interesting, and I think anybody looking at this would go, well, this is definitely amateur hour. So the person that's pleading here that was captured is Matthew Lane in Massachusetts, who's the 19-year-old that you were talking about that's a college student, that he was working with a co-conspirator in another state. And so they apparently, I can't tell to what degree, I skimmed through the charges and, legal stuff just bores me to tears. But this co-conspirator was involved in some of it. They did earlier attack a telecom provider and try to ransom them.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was PowerSchool. And it sounded like they negotiated, doing a video and showing the victims that they were destroying the data. But then some schools, and I believe even individuals, were contacted and being extorted outside of that
Right.
with what they believe was validated data. So I think they were trying to double dip and had sold,
Right. What a surprise they didn't actually delete the data after you paid them, right?
Yeah. So you may be hearing about this again, because if they did in fact sell that data to other third parties to make a little coin off of it, it could be that those people are going to try to recoup that and extort some of the parties here.
Yeah. And I'll also note this was not, elite exploit. The Matthew Lane apparently got access to an employee's credentials, so username and login. I think one of the issues with PowerSchool is once he got those credentials, he logged in, then transferred all of these records to a cloud server in Ukraine. And I don't know why that didn't cause alarms to go off inside of PowerSchool. Like, wait a minute, what is happening here? Maybe it did. I don't know, but he was able to exfiltrate 70 million records before anyone was able to stop him. So
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I've forgotten about that part, but it's maybe the most important takeaway from this. So stolen credentials, they didn't go into details. I don't know if multi-factor was enabled, but that would have been something.
Mhm.
I also don't know why any single employee would have access to the entire data set. I mean, if we follow all of you people out there, all of you people that are going, no, zero trust is not a thing. Y'all need to stop talking about it. So this would have been perfect zero trust architecture, right? From an identity perspective to go, you only have access to the stuff that you absolutely need to have access to. And for any user or even an application, that's whatever data sets down very granularly to subsets of a database. So yeah, lots of questions about why was the credential not protected with multi-factor? What exactly did the attackers log into? What else might be vulnerable? And then how did they exfil without being caught? To a server in Ukraine. Why did
Right.
DLP not catch that?
Yes.
So I think, again, this is not going to be the last we hear about this story. I think there's more to unpack here.
And again, I harp on this, but why are you collecting social security numbers? Even if the school uses it as an identity record, you could take that and turn it into another number that has no value outside of PowerSchool. It just drives me crazy that we are using social security numbers as an identifier in stored data systems that we don't need it. It should stop happening.
I don't disagree with you, but I do understand because not everybody uses PowerSchool. So if the kid transfers out into somewhere else, or they have, it is tied to federal funding that's tied to social security numbers, et cetera. So I don't know. I have mixed feeling. I agree. If it was just protected better, I would be okay with it because it is a unique identifier, because we need some type of global unique identifier. And I have many friends that stand up on stage and speak and share their social security number at the beginning of every talk. So we can put some protections around it, but I think it's reasonable to expect a security professional to execute that. It's less reasonable to expect 60 or 70 million, kids and or their parental units to deal with that.
Right. That's what I mean. Like, if we're going to use this information, it's at least the responsibility of PowerSchool to come up with a system that makes sure that these sensitive social security numbers are better protected than they were.
Yeah, they absolutely should have been encrypted and not available.
Like some 12-year-old, when they turn 19 and decide to apply for a first credit card might find out, oh, I have a credit score of 0 because somebody's been using a fake credit card in my name for the last 5 years, right? That's frustrating.
Yeah, and that does happen, yeah.
Anyway, getting off my hobby horse here. We'll move on. Moving on to a story about what they're calling Signalgate and TeleMessage. There's a Signal knockoff app called TeleMessage. It was being used by folks in the Trump administration, and it got breached. So Wired has a story. They talked to the hacker who did it about how they did it, sharing details on TeleMessage. And it's relevant because, as I mentioned, high-level members of the Trump administration, including the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, were using TeleMessage Signal. And the issue is that, Signal, it's an end-to-end encrypted app. It's not storing copies of the message. This TeleMessage Signal, this knockoff app, is storing archives of the message, which goes against the whole idea of end-to-end encryption, but is probably because they needed to follow federal record preservation laws, but they just were doing it using a crappy app.
Exactly. Now, this was actually, we said that the Trump administration is using it. It was actually in place before that. So this is something that's been persistently in use by several federal organizations in administration for several years. And just like you said, the reason is when any organization, if they're highly regulated or they just may have a lawsuit, or in public sector, we've got FOIA requests here in the US, right? We have requirements with those organizations to preserve. And there's a lot of interesting case studies over the years. So one of the things I teach, one of the workshops and trainings I do is like planning and executing a BYOD strategy. And part of that is understanding, obviously, hashtag not a lawyer, but understanding what are the legal considerations that you need to go discuss with your legal team.
Right.
Because some of the precedents for this, multi-million-dollar lawsuits and losses and wins related to a company having a third-party contractor, and that contractor was texting with somebody on their personal phone, and the original company that had contracted to that person was found to be at fault for not having control over that communication, right? The spoliation of evidence if that user switches phones or something. Mm-hmm. So long story short, there's a lot of weird, twisty legal reasons and compliance reasons why organizations can't just let people use end-to-end encryption and willy-nilly privately message people and not have the evidence if it's work-related.
Yeah, particularly in the federal government, because if you are acting as a federal official, anything you do in regard to your job as a federal official is an official record and needs to be preserved. That's the law. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is also true in publicly traded companies, and it is also true in any organization that might be going under e-discovery for any purposes, criminal litigation, et cetera. So lots of organizations have these requirements, and a lot of the calls I've been taking recently are, dealing with, okay, how do we get a handle on this? So Signal is one app. I think most of us, it's our preferred app. There's also WhatsApp and other, iMessage, et cetera. So the problem with those is when you talk about end-to-end encryption, your endpoint, your device, your phone has one key of that. And then whatever you're communicating to, which is usually another user, has the other one. And so you can't, without putting other processes and infrastructure in place, you can't inject yourself into that
Yeah.
naturally to get a copy of that to archive it off for legal purposes.
Yes.
So now WhatsApp and some of the apps do have, business or enterprise tiers that do have a mechanism, and they operate differently through APIs so that you can connect into, your corporate infrastructure and archiving, et cetera. I mean, you can even plug these things into Microsoft Purview and ingest that there. This is how the ecosystem is designed. Signal's a little bit different. It's all open source. They don't license anything there, and it is only end to end. So the only way to get Signal messages is to get it one end of that connection on the endpoint.
Right.
So what they do is this the reason it's called a knockoff app, it's a way to use or replace Signal with something that allows them to follow those guidelines. And so TeleMessage is probably one of the more popular platforms, and they were just actually acquired by Smarsh, which is one of the companies that's been well known in this space of how do we have compliant messaging archiving for corporate records retention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the thrust of the Wired story was how simple it was for a hacker to figure out how to get access to those archived messages.
Well, then there's that.
Right.
Sorry, I was just trying to explain why, because this isn't an attack on the use of TeleMessage. It's not an attack on any of the officials here.
No, they were trying to follow the law, apparently, and preserve those records. Yes.
However, the platform itself, to your point,
had a problem.
Yeah. You're getting into toes when you talk about the number of problems that we counted here. So it was pretty interesting because TLDR, there's kind of like a bash dump access where a sub-process application that they're using for that dumps a bunch of information, including clear text messages, credentials, et cetera. I had heard somewhere else that the client app that you install also had hard-coded credentials for connecting up into their kind of cloud archive platform. So basically there was stuff exposed. It sounds like there was a hard-coded credential. First of all, that's bad. And then secondly, it sounds like it was exposed with, some debug and troubleshooting access publicly to the internet. And the attackers were able to, attacker is probably the wrong word. Maybe researcher is the right word.
Yeah, this was not a malicious attack. It was just a proof of look how bad their security is.
Yeah. So they were able to access that just in a web browser and get a dump of data in clear text that was, inappropriate for anybody to have access to. So I have a feeling, I don't know anything about TeleMessage beyond, the basics of what I've seen and heard from other places. I'm guessing they're probably going to need to, tuck in and regroup a little bit and re-architect. And I don't even know how long it's been since Smarsh bought them, but if that's newer, it might be that, this was on their roadmap and they just haven't gotten around to it. But definitely some changes need to happen. If you are in an organization that's using this platform, I think you probably need to do a little bit of investigation internally and see if that program needs to be paused or you need to work with them to work through some mitigations.
Contact your Smarsh representative.
Yeah.
Links in the show notes, particularly to that Wired story if you want the gory details. A few more stories before we wrap. First, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, has a new paper out that's proposing what they're calling the likely exploited vulnerabilities, or LEV metric. This is, I think, a mathematical formula to improve what's already existing, the exploit prediction scoring system data. This is all based on a lot of vulnerabilities out there. We already have like KEV, the known exploited vulnerabilities. We have the exploit prediction scoring system to predict sort of what vulnerabilities are likely to be exploited. This is a new metric that they're trying to develop to see if they can get more accurate and better predict of all the thousands of vulnerabilities that come out every year, what's likely to get hit.
Yeah, I'm laughing at, likely exploited vulnerability. We've got LEVs and KEVs and CVEs and CVSS and EPSS and blah, blah, blah. So I like the idea of it because it does feel, there's different scoring systems to help kind of work through the math or prioritization of how critical something might be and how this is now how likely it might be. Because in the absence of that, what we really have is a long list of CVEs, so a long list of vulnerabilities, and then a very tiny, like I had the stats up for this the other day. It's when I say a fraction of, I mean like a percent or less of all of those CVEs are actually actively being exploited.
I think it might have been like 0.5%, like less than 1%, are known to be actively exploited.
Yep. So it's binary at that point because we're focused on that tiny, the 0.1% or 0.5 or whatever it was that's actively being exploited, because we can't possibly tackle the 12,000 other things that come up on that vulnerability scan. So it would be nice to have something in between that's more data driven. And I think that's what they're aiming for here. I think they do feel like they need some additional, public-private partnership and somebody to take some ownership of this, so we don't have a repeat of what happened with like the CVE system and MITRE and federal funding. I do think this has potential. I would love to see this.
Yeah, I mean, anything we can do to help organizations prioritize vulnerabilities, particularly before they get to KEV, because, if you're one of the people who have been exploited, KEV isn't much help. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Somebody was first.
Right. You don't want to be first.
It's not me.
Yeah. And sticking with, NIST and CISA, the news site Cybersecurity Drive is reporting that the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, is losing top leadership across the organization. The story says, quote, 5 of 6 CISA's operational divisions and 6 of its 10 regional offices will have lost top leaders by the end of the month. I think that's a concern to have, senior leadership evaporating at an organization like CISA.
Yeah. I mean, we know we're cutting government bloat spend and all of that. I think it's created a lot of uncertainty for people about, their future. So yeah, it sounds like some people, of course, have been let go, but it sounds like a lot of people are just kind of bailing at this point. And I bring this up only really to kind of underscore that the face of cybersecurity, at least here in the US, I think could substantially change in the next, 12 to 18 months. That doesn't mean it's going to be worse. I think ultimately it could be better if we get, the whole industry together to support these systems. But for example, I fully expect in some of these cuts, because there's people leaving, but there's also, I think they're cutting a third of CISA's workforce nationwide. And I'm imagining that probably, some of the first cuts are going to be the CISA liaisons we have in each of the regions. And those are the first touch points for both public and private organizations when they need, security support. So we leverage them a lot for critical infrastructure because, you might think of CISA working with, large federal agencies or state agencies, but the reality is, they're oftentimes the first relationship and resource for, all of the tiny municipal water treatment plants,
Mm-hmm.
All of these little underfunded, undereducated people who don't have cybersecurity people on staff, and they need to understand how to get resources, whether it's support, free assessments from whoever is going to provide those, through programs that are federally funded, or who to contact when there's an incident or possible incident. So I do think that things are going to change in the next 12 to 18 months. And, we might be just talking about some new and different stuff as it relates to cybersecurity programs.
Yeah, I guess I just feel like it's a little short-sighted going back to one of our top stories about rogue components inside critical infrastructure in the US and the complexity of trying to identify that and remediate it or protect against it when your CISA is about cybersecurity and infrastructure security. So
Yeah.
if it's really critical, then maybe we should be investing in it and not cutting it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I definitely, just to be clear, I definitely hope CISA stays around, and I hope that they continue a lot of the programs that they've been doing. But it is going to change. I don't know how it's going to change, but it's going to change. And I don't know. I don't have a magic 8 ball for that one.
Change is inevitable, whatever else.
Change is inevitable.
That's,
Yes.
we can say that for sure. All right, a couple more stories before we wrap. First, there's an issue with Microsoft OneDrive file picker, and JJ, you found this story.
Yeah, this was interesting, but the long story made short is that if you are using some, web-based application and you're browsing and you decide to, or even something like Slack, and you are uploading something from OneDrive through OAuth, the thing that you're uploading to may make a request to have access to the entire OneDrive store instead of just that file. But you don't know that as the user. And I think some of the concern is that we need to have better, communication to that user who's looking at that prompt to make a smart decision around it. So that needs to be more granular, and there needs to be better communication, because if somebody goes to a malicious site and uploads a file, because think about how many times you might go to a free photo editor online, or a free this or a free that, and it's like, oh, upload a photo to edit it, or upload this to edit it, and you upload it, and then if that service is malicious, they then have access to everything in OneDrive.
I see. Okay. Yep, that's a problem.
Yep.
Yeah. I guess Microsoft has, disclosed this responsibly, acknowledged the problem, working on a fix though.
Yeah, and I mean, they're saying now it's worth considering temporarily removing the option to upload files using OneDrive through auth. I mean, I think this is one where you've got to kind of make your own decisions around risk, both personally with a personal OneDrive account, and then of course we do have OneDrive in business as well. So maybe there's some controls at the tenant level for things like that. But it is something I think to be aware of because I certainly did not know that.
All right, our last story for the day. Microsoft and the Dutch government have discovered a new Russian hacking group called Void Blizzard. They're targeting critical infrastructure, government, defense contractors, and trying to disrupt supply chains, particularly to the Ukraine. Void Blizzard, hard to argue, a great name. If I was going to be in an attacking group, I'd want a cool name like Void Blizzard.
That's Microsoft's name for it. I can't remember what the Dutch government's name for it was. It was something a little bit different. But anyway, yeah, the two interesting things here, one of them's not terribly new. So mechanisms here, they're using spear phishing for credential theft.
Mm-hmm.
They are getting into Teams chats and meetings. That's not new. Something that sounded new to me, or at least I haven't hit before, is that they're saying that this group abuses legitimate cloud APIs to list and exfiltrate data from any mailboxes available to the compromised user. And probably anybody that manages Microsoft environments has picked up on that because that could be mailboxes and folders belonging to somebody else that the compromised user has access to. So sometimes we have mailbox delegations. Sometimes we have tiered permissions of, if Sally works for Michael, then Michael has access to Sally's stuff, or a coworker or a peer does.
Or an executive assistant might have access to their boss's.
Even better example. Yeah. So the EA gets compromised. If he or she has access into an executive's mailboxes and folders, then yeah. So I thought that was kind of new and interesting and something to think about because I don't see many organizations routinely audit things like, mailbox and folder, delegation and tiered permissions within the Microsoft environment.
Yeah, definitely something to look out for. All right, that does wrap up our news roundup for the month. Thank you for listening. We have the link to that story if you want to get more details, and that does wrap up our news roundup for the month. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Packet Protector. If there's a topic you want us to cover, or if you have a comment or a correction or a question about anything we said today, you can always reach out at packetpushers.net/FU. That is follow-up. We do love it. We appreciate it when listeners reach out, and we do try to respond. And just a reminder that Packet Protector is part of the Packet Pushers podcast network. That network includes a dozen technical podcasts for your professional development on things like networking, security, IPv6, DevOps, and more. We've got an industry blog, 2 weekly newsletters, a community Slack group, a YouTube channel, even an IRC group. You can find everything at packetpushers.net, all free with no login required. And always remember to do your security push-ups.